Hi, welcome to this month's supervision quick tip. We're going to go over the code for January 1st, 2022. We'll go brief overview for anyone who is newly certified and anyone who's well established as a supervisor. The good news is this is an opportunity for you to either establish behaviors and routines and protocols in your practice that align with the new code, or to continue to grow and incorporate these changes in a way that helps us continue to make ongoing improvements in our field. So good stuff all around. Let's dive into it with a brief overview to help anyone who is still not sure what's going on with the code. It's important that you're aware on January 1st, 2022, this is an enforceable code. So for purposes of alleged violations and in any other things in that arena, you will be held to these particular code standards that are now in place. So it's very important that you take a moment to really read through this information and understand how it translates into practice. Okay, so the new ethics code houses supervisor responsibilities under section 4, responsibility to supervisees and trainees. There are 12 subsections in this, which is broken down, and we'll just go through each one and do a quick overview of how this may look in practice, things you may need to consider, and actions you may need to take as follow-up. So 4.01, compliance with supervision requirements. Fundamentally, what this is saying is, as a supervisor, for a trainee or a supervisee, okay, and a trainee is someone who is seeking fieldwork certification, so seeking the credential, certification credential, and a supervisee is basically everyone else. So it could be a registered behavior technician, another type of stakeholder. So categorically, we have those two broad buckets. Making sure that you are aware of rules and regulations that apply to that type of relationship, and ensuring that you have full understanding and can comply with the modalities required before you commence engaging in that relationship. So this is sort of like an antecedent sort of stop and check. Do I have all the things I need? Do I have the resources in order to actually conduct this in a way that conforms with all those other structures and third-party entities and overlapping variables? So that's a stop and check. You need to be aware of that, because you don't want to say yes and then on the back end say, wait a second, I didn't realize this or this logistical requirement, or I couldn't use this type of video technology. And so it's important that you stop and really get clarity on that particular relationship and the rules around it. Then you're going to go into supervisory competence, and this was in the previous code theme, and it really outlines scope of competence, which I think for some people may be difficult to conceptualize and practice. But essentially, you have scope of practice, which outlines what you are legally should be able to do based off of your professional credential, and scope of competence means what you actually know how to do well enough to with a consumer independently and unsupervised. And so you should only be providing supervision in an area of competence in which you have you're fluent, you have the skill sets, and you demonstrated competency yourself for a while so that you can train someone else to do those behaviors. And if you are not able to, then you should seek out mentorship and additional training so that you can develop competence. So just making sure that you are also along those themes as a supervisor, that is an area of competence. Being a supervisor is its own thing, like teaching adults other behaviors. So you need to also ensure that this is an area of competence for you. So it's not just the population you may be using your skill sets with it, but it's also you as a supervisor. Your population is your trainee or supervisee, and do you have those skill sets to be effective? So also asking yourself, do I have competence to be an effective supervisor? That's a question I don't know that we ask ourselves often. We just default assume we can do it. Supervisory volume, I talk a lot about this. I consider this a administrative procedural safeguard, and I have a lot of resources available on this, but essentially this is sort of, again, all things that are, I would consider antecedent strategies to protect the integrity of the field. It's critical that you have the bandwidth consistently to prioritize supervision at your job site or whatever your occupational setting may be. And I have a lot of resources available on how to analyze this, but it's important that this is a routine part of your practice as a behavior you engage in before you just just continually accept supervisees or trainees. So that's an action item you may need to consider because it does require a documentation component. As you can see, 4.02 and 4.01 don't have the word documentation. So that is an action item for 4.03 is to be aware of. Moving on to 4.04, accountability and supervision. So this says behavior analysts are accountable for their supervisory services that occur and that as part of the supervisee relationship or supervisor trainee relationship. Okay. And that generally just means that integrity, accountability, and that you're responsible for what you're doing. That's essentially what the takeaway is on that. Okay. 4.05, maintaining supervision documentation. Okay, so behavior analysts create, update, store, dispose of documentation related to their supervisees or trainees by following all third-party entity requirements, including and protecting confidentiality. You ensure that your documentation is accurate and complete, and you maintain that per minimally at least 7 years if it's related to supervision for a trainee. And so this really hones in on the shift for documenting what you're doing, like creating permanent products, having well-organized, succinct systems of organization that create structures that are easy for you to just have in place. So this is also, again, an antecedent component. You need to make sure you have these pieces set up either at your job site. So online, there's plenty of online options now that offer this type of service where you can do cloud-based storage so that you don't have to use like just regular paper pencil. There's so many online versions that are compliant with all third-party funders that you can use and that you should consider because you're looking at organizational efficiency or individual efficiency so that you can find documents as needed and be in compliance. So just really making sure you have structures in place for documentation as its own thing before you get started. You don't want to have to figure it out afterwards. 4.6, providing supervision and training. And so this is really the meat of what we do. Like this is where your competence comes in, is like, are you teaching skills to that empower our next generation? And are you able to adjust instruction and deliver feedback? So this is just the core behaviors of what we're doing as a supervisor. You're teaching. Okay, so no big changes there. And if you're not sure how to engage in performance and competency-based measures, that's part of what is entailed here is you have to have some standard that your supervisee and trainee meets so that you can then hold them accountable to a something that is static as you then change your intervention to address their performance. Hopefully progress going up, but if not, that you have to have that metric and that standard there. Okay. Then 4.07. And I want to say for 4.06, you should also have a documentation system for that. So that's important. Like what are you doing? The same way you would if you were analogous like to a teacher or a medical chart. What is the baseline? What are the metrics? What was done? What changed? You need to have all these things kind of built in. So as much as you can, having everything in one location within like one software system or one like Google Drive or whatever, works best for you and your supervisor or trainee, it's best to have all these things trying to integrate them together because it reduces the amount of response effort and makes you and your trainee or supervisee more efficient. Okay. 4.07, incorporating and addressing diversity. So I think this was a really neat feature that was incorporated into the supervision part of the code. And it says that during supervision and training, behavior analysts actively incorporate and address topics related to diversity. And they provide examples. I think there's a lot here to unpack, and there's a lot probably for all of us, especially those of us who've been practicing a while, to digest this and make sure that we're very thoughtful about how we incorporate this part of the code into practice. And so I'm even for myself, these are that's a professional goal for myself where I'm educating myself right now on that actively by consulting with others so that I can do a thoughtful job and as I rework my own supervision protocols to incorporate and address this and systematically and thoughtfully and respectfully because it's important that we're able to do this because we serve humans and humans are everyone. There's a whole continuum, and we need to be very thoughtful about how our behaviors look as supervisors so that we're able to do that well and effectively. So I'm personally looking forward to that as one of my professional goals, is continuing to expand this area. And I encourage anyone who's listening, if that's an area that is new for you, to also seek out continuing education and mentorship. Those are things I'm currently doing right now. So I encourage anyone to do that. 4.08. Performance monitoring and feedback. Again, this is another core part of being a supervisor. You have to provide feedback and progress monitoring so that your supervisee or trainee knows what's going on. And again, it's important here, keywords, document is a word we continue to see in this part of the code, that you have to have some sort of, like, what was your baseline? What was your metrics? When did you reassess? It's the same way for any other type of service, like a medical model where you're drawing blood and looking at different levels. Do they change in school settings? Are grades coming up? Are standard measures changing? It's the same thing. And so you have to, along the lines of just effective teaching, get that information and let the person know how they're doing, providing that feedback. And some of it can be immediate or delayed, but that's part of your supervision instructional design. So you need to be doing it, and you need to document that you're doing it, because it helps you then problem solve later when you're attempting to help your learner acquire behavior. Okay, 4.09, delegation of tasks. So this is a really important one that I like to emphasize, because it is, linked to one of the higher reported alleged violations within a white paper that was published on the BACB's website. Improper delegation. So it's really important that you stop and consider what that means. Like, when you hear the words, but what does that actually mean in practice if you convert what an improper delegation means? And so if someone hasn't demonstrated competency at a certain standard, and then you release them to go and perform that in practice with a consumer unsupervised, that may be an improper delegation. And ultimately what we're trying to avoid, so considering like risk mitigation, is harm to the user, harm to the consumer. And so that's why you've got third-party structures in place who also have, delegation requirements about who can and cannot do certain procedures. So for example, an insurance company would not approve a phlebotomist to do heart surgery. And there's a reason why, because they haven't met minimum knowledge, skills, and abilities to perform that type of procedure with a user. So the risk of harm to the user is so high that there's no way that they would approve that. So similar to our practice setting, we have third-party funder requirements in place as well for those same sorts of safeguard systems. But also for you as a supervisor, it's important that you understand what this means, is if your potential supervisory trainee has not met documented competency at a certain standard and across multiple different demonstrations, not just one time at 80% or 100, but a few times, right? Consecutive times, you've got it. If you're releasing them to perform the behavior unsupervised on site with a patient, know that there is potential risk for something to go wrong because they haven't demonstrated competency. And so that's where improper delegations have a point of entry to come in. From a more practical day-to-day, and then you have your overriding requirements set forth by third-party entities that will rule in or rule out a delegation of a certain clinical skill. But those things are really important. So I think just from a takeaway standpoint, if you're not comfortable with delegation decisions or understanding really what this means, I've got additional resources coming out just for you to consider educating yourself. It's important for you to understand what cost benefit is, risk mitigation, and kind of developing strategies on how you would overcome certain situations or address these things. But it's important you do understand what this particular part of the code means. And ultimately it is trying to reduce potential harm to a consumer in this situation. Okay, 4.10, evaluating effects of supervision and training. This is consistent with the previous code theme. And we should always be evaluating our behavior, so self-evaluation, and or having ways to incorporate others providing us feedback. But essentially you should look at taking some metrics on outcomes of your behavior, because that's what we're doing. We're interested to know, like, did my trainee pass their exam? Did my trainee meet all their target skills? And you can look at different metrics to kind of do that analysis. However, key word here is there's a documentation process as well, so that you can adjust behavior. Because if you're going to take on the responsibility of being a supervisor, you are a gatekeeper. Therefore, it is critical that you are always in ongoing evaluation, so that you are doing the best you can to ensure we're being effective with our population, which is supervisees and trainees in this case. And so please make sure you are being thoughtful. And as an action item, you may need to consider, how would I establish a self-evaluation or an evaluative process where you can pull in peers to help you consider data you may want to take in relation to supervision. 4.11, facilitating continuity of supervision. So this one specifically, I really liked, because previously this would have just been written in the contract in the previous ethics code. I really liked that they outlined and teased apart the behaviors a little bit more, and gave examples, so that it's really clear, like as an antecedent, you're communicating what would happen, like if you got into like a car accident, or you were out on maternity leave or family leave or something, vacation, or something unplanned that happened, like an environmental emergency. So like what happens, and having a plan for that, because that we know things happen, it's life. And so having that kind of really clearly documented in that contract ahead of time, and making sure all parties understand, if this condition happens, this is what we'll do, and just having a plan, just having something, so that it's really clear what would happen in the event of that supervision relationship. You just need to have some plan, like A, B, or C. And along those lines, 4.12, appropriately terminating supervision. So this is similar. I think that the responsibility of being really clear about what happens when you need to terminate a relationship. And there could be multiple different reasons. Like the supervisor may have their own issue, like a medical issue or some major life event where they just cannot continue the relationship, or there may be other variables that necessitate the termination of the relationship. And so you have to be thoughtful about, okay, just like you would for a client, we would not abruptly just leave a client without being thoughtful about, here's at least some referrals. I can't help you. I've got an emergency. I literally cannot help you, but I've taken the time to write down 5 people who may be able to. Just as a worst case scenario, you shouldn't just abandon your supervisees or trainees. You have some responsibility to say, I may be so like this unavailable, I can't even take a phone call, but here's an email, please call this, and this person. But having that behavior, like knowing that you have to do that, is part of your responsibility as a supervisor, because we're not abandoning our supervisees and trainees. And also you being thoughtful ahead of time, if something were to happen, what would you do, so that you're not reacting, you're responding. So I really like to encourage people to have these pieces and these features built into your supervision contract, because it makes you as a supervisor more aware of the behavior, and it also cues in your trainee and supervisee, especially a trainee who's going to be a supervisor one day, as a model to show them, and also gives them the rule, like, okay, if these things happen, which they may because it's life, these are the things that we'll do. We have a plan, or this is what I can expect from my supervisor, or these are the expectations my supervisor has from me under these conditions. I hope this information was helpful as an overview of the upcoming code changes. Please email me, contact me at greenspacebehavior.com if you need any other help.
Stay connected to Greenspace Behavior, where the possibility is always yes. Follow us on Instagram and like us on Facebook. Check us out, www.greenspacebehavior.com.